Hello, food and beverage technology enthusiasts. Welcome to another exciting episode of the FoodTech Innovators Podcast, where we explore the transformative impact of technology and success stories in the world of food and beverage manufacturing. Today, I'm Steven Burton, your host, and I'm happy to be here today with Delos Santos of Biofect, who has some really interesting technologies that he's developing related to microbial fermentation. So microbial fermentation, like I'm familiar with, beers, of course, and other sorts of alcoholic beverages. I know about fermentation for salamis and that sort of thing, but kind of what's your angle on this, and how is that related to what we might think of as traditional fermentation? And explain to me what you mean by microbial as opposed to, traditional microbial fermentations.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steven. It's fantastic to be here. And to your point, we are using a technology at Biofect Innovations called microbial fermentation, or more specifically, people call it precision fermentation. And the way it differs from regular fermentation, as you mentioned, salami, right? What we're doing here is we're using microbes as a platform to produce target molecules. So imagine, I think the best way I can explain it is if we can kind of just briefly jump into the story of insulin, right? When insulin was discovered in the 1900s, we used to obtain it from animals, right? And insulin was the poster child of modern medicine, cured diabetes, for example. But not many people realize that from the 1900s up until the 1980s, we used to harvest it from animals. So 50,000 animals, for example, to give you a number, to get just a kilo of insulin. We had to kill that many animals. So lots of suffering, lots of waste. Until the 80s, when we discovered that we can essentially just program a microbe like E. coli. And what I mean by program is you can, bioengineer it so that instead of, taking it from a cow, you're programming it to produce insulin. And again, the traditional sense of fermentation, once you have a bioengineered microbe like an E. coli, you can put it in a fermentation tank, and as it's growing, it's also producing that insulin that you programmed into that microbe. So in a way, this is you're fermenting the microbe to produce the target ingredients. And this is, in a nutshell, the technology that we're leveraging in Biofect, where it serves as a platform to produce biomolecules from nature without necessarily needing nature itself.
Two things that just pop into my mind when I heard that introduction from you. One is that our software system, like a big part of it, is related to food safety and making sure that the food is safe. And the microbial pathogens that we're oftentimes trying to avoid include E. coli, of course. So we're trying to eliminate E. coli from food. And the whole notion of introducing E. coli into food, sounds really scary. But I imagine that that's not exactly what you're suggesting, right? Is your product safe?
Yeah, so the cool thing about this is, as amazing and as interesting as it is, making insulin, it's actually been used in the food industry for quite some time, almost the same time as when insulin was introduced. For example, rennet, right? Rennet is a byproduct of milk. It's an enzyme that you find in there. And typically, the traditional way to obtain it is through milk. You would harvest the milk, you would find rennet, and maybe you'll find the enzymes to curd the milk. So then you'll make cheese. We discovered that we can actually produce this enzyme using this similar approach. For example, you have an E. coli in my previous example, you can program it to make insulin, but now you're programming it to make rennet. So now you're harvesting that enzyme from this process. So that's just one of the initial applications of this technology towards the food space. The cool thing that Biofect we're really interested about is beyond sort of enzymes, right? What about actual food products? What about actual ingredients that we put in our food? We can essentially recreate any biomolecule from nature with this technology so you can make food ingredients that are more sustainable. For example, one key aspect that I'm sure maybe you've heard about, Steve, was there's companies all around the globe making dairy, right? So dairy proteins. They're using this technology to make proteins that you would naturally get from an animal. So whey protein, casein protein. Imagine making the exact same molecule that you would get from an animal without the animal, and then you can make products that are actually dairy-like without being necessarily tied to deriving from animal. I think this is the next cusp of our food innovation, where we can finally have our cakes and eat it too, right? Guilt-free, and that's what we all strive for.
Okay, with rennet, I've have some experience with that because of the support we do for third-party certifications, particularly kosher in halal, where rennet may not be kosher. But there is artificial rennets, and almost the entire cheese industry has already changed over. So there's this artificial rennet produced using essentially the process that you've developed, and that's what's taken over the market? Or are you talking about something different, typical industrial artificial rennets?
E. coli, it's gotten a bad rep, right? Because when we think about microbes, when we say E. coli, there's not just one type of E. coli. There's several strains. Some of them are pathogenic, meaning that they hurt people, and some of them are safe, relatively, toxin-free. And those are the ones that we're talking about when we want to create these ingredients using the microbes. E. coli is just one subset, for example. There's many different strains. Like we can even go like yeast, baker's yeast, for example. When you bake, we can program those yeasts to produce other things as well. And in fact, the food industry and any technology using this microbial fermentation, they typically go for yeast, which are safe, relatively safe. And one thing I'll say too is you have to be diligent. For example, you had a great point there, where if you're creating, let's say, rennet or insulin using this technology, you have to make sure that you purify the insulin out of the processing tool. So the processing tool, which is your engineered microbe, is completely separate, and it's not in your final product. So this is how we can address some of the safety concerns. And as we've learned from GMO, right, we have to be careful and we have to be transparent and clear with our communication. And I think it's no exception for precision fermentation.
So do you have like a standard sort of suite of products that you produce, or do you take sort of orders for custom designed products?
Yeah, I think this is, in most cases, from my understanding, most of our rennet is coming from microbes nowadays. So similar to insulin, most of our insulin now, almost all of it, is coming from microbial sources. So I would imagine the artificial sources of rennet could easily be derived from this process. So I do think that's just the poster child for microbial fermentation in the food industry. There's more that maybe you're not even aware of that you're consuming already, right? And you, as in all our consumers, like if you take a look at your grocery store products, you take a look at the label, you will see, in the US more specifically, bioengineered ingredients. And those ingredients are naturally derived from this exact same process of microbial fermentation, precision fermentation, which is why I think we're just at the cusp of what we're producing. There's bound to be more. And again, transparency and communication is key here.
Yeah, please continue. That sounds fascinating. And a concrete example, I think, would really help kind of gel the whole concept together.
So the grand vision, Steve, for this is we're a platform so that we can produce different ingredients that a customer may need, right? Because this is what we want to do. We want to create something that somebody needs, not just something that we think is cool. Although there's so many different ingredients out there that we think is valuable. At the end of the day, we have to address our consumer needs. And we are getting, for example, feedback from different ingredient manufacturers. So these incumbents asking me, well, Christian, can Biofect Innovations produce me protein A, protein C, molecule B, molecule C? And you can't do them all. So you have to focus on one single ingredient. As an early stage company, as a young, energetic, driven biotech company, you have to focus on one ingredient that you think will capture the market, that produces the most impact. So for us, while we do have a suite of ingredients on the list, there's one key ingredient that we're highly focused about, which I'm sure we'll get into the discussion next. And this protein is actually called braisine. And this is quite interesting if you'd like to learn, Steve.
That sounds really interesting. So you're saying that I could actually purchase a kilo of this sweet from you, and it would be equivalent to 2,000 kilos of sugar?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I mentioned already, the platform itself, there's so many different things that you can solve with it. Like you and I can walk the Amazon rainforest. We can take a look at a plant. We can take a look at a flower. We can see the sights, the smells, the taste even, right? And we can, imagine, I want to take that back to Canada. Like I want to scale that whatever scent I'm smelling in Canada. What we can do is we can take the DNA, engineer into our microbe, and then grow it in a fermentation tank. And there you have it. We left the forest intact, the plant intact, and we have the product. So the sky's the limit, as long as it has a genetic basis. So for us, when we were discussing amongst our team, what product do we want to create? The long story short is that we wanted to create an ingredient that can solve a fundamental problem in the food industry, which is, I'm sure we all share it as consumers, our sugar addiction, right? And the reason why we decided, we're going to tackle sugar addiction is because of so many different hosts of problems. It's in everything you find in your grocery products. More than 75% of products have sugar, by the way. And governments around the world, they're taking notice because, sugar is a risk factor for many diseases, like chronic inflammation. And they're putting new labels on high in sugar products, taxations on producers for products that contain high sugar. So that's a problem that I'm seeing. So now when we decided we got to solve that problem, we found out about braisine. And I'm going to tell the story about braisine because I love telling this story. So pardon me, Steve. Braisine is a protein that you find in a West African fruit called the oublie berry. And the cool thing about oublie is it's named after the French word oublier, which means to forget. The reason why they named the fruit to forget is because the story goes when babies eat the fruit, they actually forget about their mother's milk, believe it or not. It's so funny. The babies forget about their mother's milk because the fruit is about 2,000 times sweeter than sugar. And when I learned about that, I'm a molecular biologist by training. I learned about this story and I said, why is the fruit so sweet? Is it because of the sugar in there? Is it because of some molecule, whatever? It turns out brazine is a protein that's found in it that is 2,000 times sweeter than sugar. So for me, it's a no-brainer. We have to scale the production of this ingredient. It's a protein and it's sweet into commercial scales. But of course, it's not scalable using traditional agriculture, right? So we decided we would just produce brazine using this platform technology. And, we've done such a good job at replicating it in the lab that, of course, we don't want to harm nature. We don't want to extract the oobleck berry from its natural sources. We're producing it in-house in Toronto in our labs, and we're ready for scaling this thing up so that it can be an alternative to the alternative sweet.
And did you develop this in the context of kind of a university environment, and then now you're commercializing it, or did you start right from the beginning as a startup?
Yeah, so no, this is starting from a startup. I did mention we were inspired, so I guess taking a step back, Biofect Innovation, it was born out of the need to apply our science. For many entrepreneurs out there that are scientists or entrepreneurs, there's a yearning for applying the expertise that they've spent many years on, if you will. And this is where our training as molecular biologists, synthetic biologists, we were looking for a problem to solve. And this is a problem that we saw where potentially we could solve. So we came across serendipitously across this fruit, through a publication, through a journal or reporting. And then we thought, oh my gosh, that's quite interesting. I wonder if we could produce something like that in the lab using this technology. And we did. And back to your question, can you buy it? I can certainly, sell it to you, but of course I'd put an asterisk in there for research purpose only, just because it's not quite regulatory approved yet. Although this ingredient, it's quite novel and it's quite new. The market has not seen it yet, but my bet would be in the next 2 years or so, it'll be in grocery shelves out there. And we hope to be one of the brands promoting that.
And how does it compare in terms of flavor profile to other artificial sweeteners? And what's the carb content?
Yeah, so carb content, because this is a protein, I would say calorie content, it would be similar to sugar. I would say similar calories as sugar. The difference is you're eating so little of it because it's 2,000 times sweeter than sugar. So the calorie, in a sense, it would be negligible, let's say, in a can of a beverage. Now, the reason why I believe that this is the next generation alternative sweetener, because of the existing alternative sweeteners, because of the problems with taste, as you mentioned. Not sure, Steve, if you try alternative sweeteners in the past, like stevia, for example, sucralose, Splenda, right? These alternative sweeteners, although they do the job in giving you that sweetness, they're not necessarily as tasty. They have off flavors, sometimes they're bitter, sometimes they're astringent. So consumers, it wouldn't be their first choice when it comes to looking for something sweet. It'll be sugar. So this is a problem in industry that, as far as I've experienced and seen, nobody has been able to solve because of the off flavors and bitter taste. Where I'm really, really excited about this ingredient is that it actually has a very unique cotton candy familiar-like taste. And it's a protein, right? So when you taste it, you will see, oh my gosh, it's so sweet. But at the same time, it doesn't have that off flavors that really dissuades the customer from repurchasing. So I'm excited about that. One thing I gotta share with you as well, that I truly believe this is going to be the next sweetener, is because it's a protein. And what does that mean? Why is it important that it's a protein? When we think about alternative sweeteners that exist out there, aspartame, stevia, sucralose, these are chemical based. These are synthetics, for example. And the idea is it goes through your body, you don't digest it, which is why it's 0 calories. You don't use it as energy. But where does it go? It goes to your gut. And what's in your gut? Your gut microbiome. So imagine it's changing your profile, your gut micro profile. And who knows what health implications this has on your body. And not to mention, if it's not being digested by your stomach, maybe it can accumulate in your internal organs, your livers, your kidney. So you wouldn't get too far on the Google result page if you're looking for headlines saying alternative sweeteners are not in anymore. Aspartame is class 2B carcinogen from last year. Xylitol, sucralose, erythritol, now they're causing DNA mutations. So what I'm seeing in the industry is not only because of the taste, because of the health, people are looking for a next solution. And it doesn't exist. But I do think in brazine it will.
I do know that there is a precedent with saccharin. Yeah, anybody who's my age group, I remember my grandmother was heavily into saccharin, and that turned out to be a carcinogen. But I've never heard that with aspartame. You're saying that aspartame has now been deemed a carcinogenic?
Yeah, it's a class 2B carcinogen. But what class 2B means, just so we can be precise here, is that there's limited evidence for it to become a carcinogen. And, you know, having taken a look at what the WHO published about it, why they deemed it to be carcinogen is because in high quantities, it can cause mutagenesis of the DNA, for example, and cancer, if you will. But this is the same way as saying phone radiation could also be carcinogenic, right? So the dose makes the poison, and certainly... I wouldn't say that, but I also wouldn't, talk, horribly about aspartame, because we needed something during the time when we introduced it. Don't get me wrong, the market needed something aside from sugar. In the 80s, we had to tackle the obesity problem to curb it down, and these alternative sweeteners were essentially the Band-Aid solution, which we needed. We needed them. It's just that now we're learning a little bit more years down the line that they're not necessarily as healthy for you in large quantities, of course. So, food producers are really looking for something new, and it doesn't exist, Steve. And I do think this is new generation of ingredients. We're starting with brazine, but it's going to be beyond sweeteners as well.
Yeah, I find that whole thing kind of intriguing. You mentioned a couple of times programming the microbes. So how specific can you be? Can I get a microbe to, transmute coal into gold, or like how variable can you, how specific can you get, and what is the capabilities? Essentially, are you limited to proteins, and or can you create other kinds of molecules as well? Like, what are your...
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great point. If we can turn something into gold, I think that's an idea. Right? And maybe I'd be talking to, Bloomberg or something at this point. But in any case, to your question, I think it's a fascinating question, because this type of question really pushes the limits of the technology, right? What is the limit? What can we do and what can we not do? And I do think, to kind of level set, to communicate the science behind it, imagine there's a certain target protein that you would find in any animal or any plant, right? And if you take a look hard enough as to where that protein or target molecule that you would find in the organic, living organism, it's dictated by a genetic code. It's dictated by the DNA, which is the Bible of life, essentially, right? In that book, you can take a look at the page and see, oh my God, this is the page that codes for brazine. You can literally just rip that page out, physically stitch it into the DNA of your microbe, and then there you have it, right? But when you're thinking about what is possible here, essentially the sky's the limit, theoretically, assuming it's coming from a biological organism. You can make proteins, you can make molecules. Some people have even begun making functional materials like textiles, for example. Silk. We don't need the silkworms anymore, or even spider silk, right? We can just make it using microbes. So to that regard, the possibility is quite high here. What I would say matters a lot is the scalability. Like, can we produce at large scales? Because there's no shortage of innovation happening in the labs right now. It's just that, do the unit economics make sense? Can we scale it economically? And do consumers even want it? Why would you want silk made using microbes when you can just get it, cheaply from, this traditional source? So these are the questions that we ask, where in theory, this would be the 3D printer for biomolecules, is just to the extent of maybe how economic and scalable they are.
I'm not sure if you've been to the grocery store lately, but the cost of meat and cheese is really high at the moment. So
I guess it could make sense now.
that might be working into your economics at the moment. So, and I was going to ask you about lab-grown meat, because also there's a bioreactor as opposed to a fermentation process. I'm not sure exactly what the difference is there, but I think it's like the current state of the art is about $25 for the piece, about the size and weight of a credit card at the moment. So it's definitely not quite ribeye sort of level yet, but imagine it's getting there.
It's not quite there yet. Yeah. And I guess to kind of put just a brief color on that, Steve. So the bioreactors, right? Think about it as your fermenter. We intertwine it, fermenters, bioreactors, and essentially with the lab-grown meat, you're replicating the conditions to grow a cell meat, for example, like a muscle cell from a cow. You're replicating the conditions in that bioreactor or fermentation tank than it is in the cow itself. So, to some degree, it is similar to what we're doing, but the final product here is the actual cell. So you multiply it, you grow it, and to your point, the scalability of it is a question that we're all trying to tackle right now. And if we can make it work, I think that's revolutionary. I can still have my meat, it tastes great, it's amazing, knowing that, you can just regenerate it in a fermentation tank instead of, harming animals and harming the environment, if you will.
Yeah, plus the time. I mean, it takes 12 to 16 months to grow a cow. So if you can do that faster, that'd be great. So is your biggest challenge sort of just reaching the economies of scale to make it economical, or do you face other challenges here as well? I guess there's also, you touched on a regulatory challenge. Are you at the point where you've applied for FDA approval, CFIA approval?
Yeah, so I think all good points, and I don't want to sound boring, but some of the challenges in this industry is really funding. right? For example, it's such a long timeline to get to profitability for maybe a cultivated meat that in that time in between, investors aren't really bold on taking that risk in these deep tech products, if you will. So this is when you have to be creative. You need to find ways to fund it, find alternative sources of revenue from products that you're selling. So it is a long road ahead. So funding, without sounding too boring, that's everybody's challenge, and it's certainly deep tech is not an exception to that. Same thing with the cultivated meat. But to your point, regulatory hurdles are also a key challenge. For example, there's regions around the world, the FDA in the US, Health Canada in Canada, we got EU in Europe. You can arrange them in order of difficulty, EU being on top. And, the FDA is relatively, it's still difficult, but is relatively the path forward, especially there's big markets there for things like these. At the current stage that we're at, we are preparing to look into that route and making sure that our processes are established, because that's what's going to be scrutinized, especially, in this day and age. People are looking at their labels, making sure that you're transparent and clear. In that fermentation tank, are you only producing brazine, or are you producing other stuff? How do you know? Can you show me? Can you tell me? Can you measure it? Can you replicate it 3 times? So these are different questions that we're answering right now. That's preparing the stage for us for that regulatory submission. But more or less, Steve, I would say there's general agreement that this is going to be mainstream. And what I've seen so far, as with the example of stevia, right? Stevia has only been approved since 2008, I believe. But the Japanese have been using it since the 80s. So the approval for that ingredient, although it's been valuable, it's taken some time. And since 2008, stevia has been approved all across the globe for most countries. So there's a sentiment here that we're working towards approving these newly improved products so that we can, create and reimagine a more sustainable way of production. So that's no exception for us. That's something that we're going through right now. Other companies are going through right now. And there's clear signals that it's going to go in that direction. It's just timing, and we kind of leave it to the hands of the regulators and policymakers.
I think there's a lot of precedent too. I mean, there are other already bioengineered products. There's a gumming agent that's quite common, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but that's produced by a bacteria, I believe. You probably have others who've tread, the path a bit smoother before you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we ride on their shoulders, right, and ride their coattails, if you will.
So how do you see your future looking like for the next 5 or 10 years, say?
Yeah, so for us, as I mentioned, the idea is developing a novel platform. And if I can speak a little bit more just briefly about that. When it comes to microbial engineering, I mentioned, a lot of people use E. coli, Saccharomyces, for example, very legacy, well-known, conventional microbes, if you will. And this is the platform. This is the chassis of the industry. But they're not necessarily the best to use for certain products, certain proteins. The reason why we're using them right now is because, you might laugh, is because we know how to use them, because we're used to it. It is the status quo, right? And often in industries, they keep doing the same thing just because it's easy, they know what to do, but it's not necessarily the most optimal. So at Biofect Innovations, this is where we took a step back and we said, let's think about this from fundamental first principles. Are we actually using the microbes that we need to use to make this unit economics make sense? Because there's a lot of proteins on the shelf out there from ingredient companies that are not making it to market because it doesn't make sense to make it using E. coli, Saccharomyces. So what we did is we're developing a novel platform to support these shelved ingredients, if you will. And we've done that. The question now, okay, Christian, you've developed this platform. Biofect Innovations is paving the way. Well, you have to show me that it works. What is your Tesla Roadster, right? People ask you the question, show me how to test a Roadster, and then I'll believe that you can make the Model X, the Model Y, and everything under the sun. And for us, we have to be diligent and careful in picking that, what is that Tesla Roadster? And brazine for us, that is our beachhead, that is our Tesla Roadster. But future looking ahead in 5 to 10 years, we want to produce the other cars. We want to produce the other products. And I do believe that Biofect Innovations, we're well positioned for that. And brazine is not a bad one to pick to start with.
What about coming up with new sort of innovative molecules that don't exist in nature? Do you have a potential to do that? Could you use artificial intelligence, for example, to design different types of molecules that we might have never encountered before?
I love that you asked that question, because I was just reading a publication. So we've all heard about AlphaFold, right? And then there's other models there where they can predict from DNA level to phenotype. And it's getting quite, scary is not the word, but it's a word that I'll use. It's getting quite advanced where where you can kind of predict the behavior of a certain host. So for us, when we think about AI and we think about how we approach product development, AI and machine learning is certainly a part of it. Because when you're thinking about a brazine, as an example, right, the sweetener that we're making, what if you want to make it not 2,000 times? What if you want to make it 10,000 times? What if you want to make it 20,000 times sweeter than sugar? Or what if you want to make it taste something else, or more digestible, or more healthy? This is when you could genetically modify the actual product itself so that it interacts in a unique way with your body to elicit whatever effects that you want. But the problem here, Steve, is we can achieve all of that, and in fact it's being done right now, is regulatory. So what happened with regulatory? Thinking about GMO, you have a production microbe that is already a GMO, and if you're producing a product that's also a GMO, then there's big barrier there to entry. Although it's going to be extremely useful, as in the case for drugs, for example. Like we're screening so many different proteins now that can be candidates as a potential therapeutic, right? We have to consider those regulatory hurdles where, although it's cool, although it's helpful, let's see how the regulators will interpret that, and let's see whether there's a path to market. Because if there's not, then it's just a cool hobby and a science project in the lab.
Yeah, as soon as you get governments involved too, sometimes it can be totally irrational. Like I know there was a genetically engineered eggplant that addressed an issue they had in India with eggplant worms, and they developed a resistant one. And the Indian government just banned all GMO products, including those specifically designed eggplants. And I think that there's about 500,000 people a year that are starving to death because they don't allow that.
It's a shame. Steve, it's like golden rice. I'm from the Philippines, and we knew all about golden rice, and people didn't want it because of the GMO sentiment, right? And it's a shame. But that's where I emphasized earlier, where communication and transparency is key here, so that we don't, see the same fate as the GMO did. Like, although now GMO is being accepted more and more, potential to feed us, the potential to, mitigate climate impact, for example, we can't make the same mistakes in communication as we've done with that, with microbial fermentation.
Yeah, you're preaching to the converted there, so I agree with you.
Great.
Absolutely. So you're operating in Canada.
That's right.
Where are you based?
We're from Toronto. So our core team is in Toronto, but we have partners all across Canada. We've worked with, some folks from the East Coast, working from some folks even closer in London, Ontario, some in Ottawa. So we're quite everywhere. And that's the name of the game. You got to find the best of the best, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, as a tech entrepreneur, I'm not a biotech entrepreneur, but just a general tech entrepreneur. But I think Canada is a great market to deal in, because there's a lot of support for that. So that's great. What kind of advice would you give to entrepreneurs who might be looking, forward to launching their own enterprise?
I would say this is an advice that I keep learning and telling myself as well, is really getting to the truth as fast as I can and as often as I can. And what I mean by that, really, I'm a scientist by training. And in my PhD, when I was studying, I spent many years, many hours on trying to solve something. And finally, when it worked, I show everybody and they say, amazing. And that's that, right? Nobody really cared about it. Just because I spent 7 years on a PhD doesn't necessarily mean people would care. And it's the same thing when you approach product, when you approach startups. You have to get to the truth as fast as you can. Although you may think your idea is cool, your technology is innovative, you have to get it in the hands of your customers so that they can tell you whether to keep going or not. And it's almost not trying to delude yourself into trying to fit that square peg into the round hole. It's the same thing for startups. You have to make something that your customers want. And I know it's easier said than done, right? It takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of mindfulness, awareness, which is very hard to do as an academically trained scientist. But I think that is the best advice that I would give myself, just to not waste time on wasteful things, although they're amazing and interesting and cool. Focus on what's needed from you right now. And that's how you would run your business as an early stage startup.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've been a serial entrepreneur all my life as well, and I once developed quite an innovative technology that was super cool, but it had no actual practical application, so I couldn't get any customers. And I'd also caution entrepreneurs not to listen too close to the investment community, because sometimes they have big opinions and very little knowledge, and they can be discouraging, and you shouldn't be discouraged by that.
That's a good advice, Steve. I'll take that too.
All right, excellent. So is there anything else you'd like to add? And also, I think we'll put down in the comments below how to get in touch with you, so you can send us some links to some propaganda that you might want us to disseminate.
Absolutely. I'm ready for that. Just want to say again, thank you for having me here. We truly believe that this technology is the way forward. When we're thinking about, grand, ambitious humanitarian goals of even colonizing, different planets, right? We're not going to bring our seeds there. We're not going to bring our plants, our animals. What we're going to bring there, our information. We're going to bring our DNA. We're going to bring our printer, and we're going to make these molecules on site using these materials and using this technology. So I do think there's a place for this in the future, and it's not meant, don't get me wrong, I want to emphasize this. It's not meant to replace existing agricultural practices. It's just meant to enhance them. It's meant to support them. It's meant to give them another avenue to produce the things that we love already. So there's no room here for villainizing one industry over another. We're all in it together, and we're all going to lift the boats with this same rising tide. So thank you for having me here, Steve.
Okay, take care, Christian. Hopefully we'll speak again sometime, and you're going to be super rich and famous then. So.
Fingers crossed. I'll make gold using this technology. So thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the FoodTech Innovators Podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion informative and inspiring. If you have any specific topics or questions you'd like us to cover in future episodes, feel free to reach out through social media or email info@icicletechnologies.com. Thanks again, and see you at the next episode of the FoodTech Innovators Podcast.